I want to know how it tasted.
Horrible. We were using this scaffold, which was like felt, and we were using muscle cells, but because we didn't exercise the cells, they were like jelly, and we didn't really grow it long enough, so the scaffold, the material, wasn't fully degraded. So it was like eating jelly on fabric.
Ew.
Yeah.
All right, so maybe not a great gourmet dish anytime soon.
And
maybe
expensive.
just as well.
Yeah.
And very expensive.
Yeah.
I can see how this is science. How is it art?
I think what we do, again, is we found an area where we don't really have a language to describe it. As artists, we're trying to find non-verbal ways to engage with those issues, as well as dealing with something that art always dealt with, and that's life. You know, what is life? And we're referring to the fact that it's a philosophical question, but it's also part of an ongoing artistic pursuit. And from our perspective, there's things that are happening to life at the moment that are extremely radical, but they are being discussed usually only in the context of science, and we really need to broaden this context. And as artists, we can't hide behind any kind of ethical justification for our actions, so I think it really sharpens the question.
The headlines that you see that address these sorts of questions are usually, well, we saw some this week, designer babies. You can be able to design your own baby. Shock, horror, they're using vegetable cells in fish. What do you think we need to be thinking about in all of this versus all the stuff that feels sort of, I don't know, just about immediate gratification and big headlines?
I think that's the interesting thing of what we do in our center, in our research center at the University of Western Australia. We opened the doors of the laboratories to people, mainly to artists, but we actually had social scientists and ethicists and philosophers, and they are coming and engaging in the most experiential way with the manipulation of life, which results in a much more nuanced discussion. And I think one of the issues with those headlines and with the whole discourse surrounding the life sciences at the moment is that it's totally hyperbole. There's like, people are hyping it from the perspective of the developers that want to show us how strong is this technology is, or how powerful the technology is. And the same way the people who are opposing it are actually playing the same game by exaggerating the dangers of that. And we really need to find a way in which we can reflect on those very important issues. And I think the most important thing from my perspective is this notion of the shifting perceptions of life. It's not really, Frankenstein is not coming up, you know, the monster is not going to eat us. But I think that we as a society really need to come to terms with what we do to life. And that would allow us to be more active participants in the discussion about and the decisions about where we're going.
What are you most concerned about given what we're doing right now?
So I have a major issue with areas concerning genetic engineering, for example, that we have no idea. And it's also interesting being embedded within the culture of science as an artist. I'm acutely aware of the shift in the postures that scientists are taking. When they talk among each other, they use the language of uncertainty because they don't know. When they talk to us, the public, they use the language of the experts. And then we believe them and we think that they know what they're doing. So when they tell us that they are about to release a genetically modified organism into the environment, they try to reassure us that actually they know what the cascade effect, how it's going to affect us in 100 years' time. From my perspective, they have very little idea of that. So I think that there's this human hybris of trying to push things further without really understanding what are the long-term effects of that.
There was one of your collaborators, Stellark, who produced some extraordinary pictures and did some extraordinary things, attaching the cell creations, the tissue creations that you and he worked on together to his own body. Tell us about this. There's an image of him with an ear in his own arm.
Yeah. So just to qualify, the ear on his own arm is a scaffold that was attached to his body. It's nothing to do with our work with him. But prior to that, we worked with him on a project where we did a quarter-scale replica of his left ear, and we made it out of human cartridge cells. So we actually grown a version of his body in a miniaturized way, using other people's cells, actually, in the shape of the ear. And it was a really interesting piece because we had like those two somewhat conflicting narratives playing there. From our perspective, we were really interested in seeing how people are going to react to something which is recognizably human. And an ear is a great shape. It's a very sculptural form, growing outside of the body, totally detached from a body of the human, growing inside this technological environment.
That was your interest.
That was our interest. Stellark's interest was part of his ongoing research and pursuit into the notion of the prosthetic as a a sign of excess, and he's interested in. He had a robotic arm, for example, a third arm that he was working with and performing with for many years. And then he decided to move to what he refers to as soft prosthetics. And he attached this, not our ear, but he attached an ear onto his arm. And he's really looking at the way, his perception is that the human body is obsolete. In the light of technology, our bodies don't fit the technology we're already kind of set up for ourselves, and we need to think about changing the body.
There are people in prosthetics in the United States, I'm thinking of Hugh Herr at MIT and others, who argue that ultimately prosthetic devices could be better than our natural devices. He also says that scientists have no responsibility for the way that society decides to apply their knowledge. Do you agree?
It's a very tricky question. I think it's obviously, and that's something we do through our interventions within the scientific laboratories, we remind scientists how their research can be used for other purposes. To some extent, it's similar to the notion of dual use of scientific research for military and civilian use.
Right.
And it can be used for other purposes. I think what's important is that everyone should participate in this debate. And it's not just the scientists, it's not just the government, it's not just the business people. That's why we want as many artists as possible to come and engage. And we believe that the best way to do it is actually by being implicated and go through this experiential process of actually being there in the laboratories, doing the work, raising the questions, problematizing it, and not necessarily agreeing with what one is doing. And art has this very privileged position within society that we are one of the very few professions that actually can bring, problematize issues rather than bring closure. We're not interested in finding solutions. We're interested in raising questions.
For people who might be watching this who perhaps have suffered injuries in wartime, Iraq or Afghanistan, from what you're understanding about the way the science is going, is there good news here for people who are looking to have not just limb replacements, but ear replacements, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think this field is, and this whole notion of regenerative medicine that tissue engineering is part of, and to some extent that's what led to this whole area of really looking at the body and how to repair the body in a totally different way. I think it's a step in the right direction. The problem is that the promises are so big and the fulfillment is so lagging behind that people would lose faith in what's happening. And you can see a lot of it happening now with stem cell research. I think there's great potential there. I think scientists shouldn't be pushed too fast, too hard to come up with results. And I think that we as a society also need to be part of the whole questioning of what are we doing to life and how it's going to result.
And the history of eugenics in this world is not very pretty. You lived in Israel for a while.
Yeah, very much so. And it is an interesting case also that the guy who invented the whole field of tissue culture, which I'm giving lectures sometimes about kind of a historical narrative of regenerative medicine without the use of DNA and genetics, which seems to really overwhelm the discourse. And they've got a set of metaphors which are about information and abstracting bodies. When you talk about it in the level of tissues and cells, which is much more visceral, and you look back at the guy who invented that, you realize that he wrote a book in 1938. His name was Alexis Carrel. He wrote a book in 1938 where he suggested the use of gas chambers to eliminate undesirable elements in human society. So one of the questions was that if he was the one who realized that you can actually fragment the body and take parts of the body and grow it outside and do things to it, and he was always interested in kind of the reintroduction of organs and cells back into bodies as a way to repair them. But the very same mode of thinking led him to think about the use of gas chambers. So we really need to question how those metaphors are being used, how the way we perceive our bodies changes also the way we perceive other bodies and how we perceive the other in general. And again, I think that as artists we can highlight those issues without trying to bring closure and without trying to resolve them, but make people think about that.
Oron Katz, thank you. You've given me a lot to think about. Oron Katz's show is up now at Exit Art in New York. We'll put up a link at our website. You can find out more about him and the other places showing his work also right there at GRITtv.org. Thank you, Oron. That was fascinating.